There are some doors that close so quietly you don't hear them shut until you're standing in the cold, and this is the story of a boy who found, behind the counter of the one door that would still open for him, more than any man in that valley thought a 19-year-old orphan deserved to find. He had been cast out by his own uncle, a man who called himself kin only when there was work to be got from him, and who put him on the road with a bedroll, a knife, and $11 folded into a handkerchief. $11 was the whole of what he owned in the world. With it, in a dying river town called Marrow Creek, he bought the wreck of an old trading post that had stood boarded and silent for 11 years, bought it outright, building and all, for $9 and the promise that he'd haul away whatever the bank didn't want. Everyone who watched him hand over that money called it the foolish spending of a foolish boy, throwing his last coins at a rotting shell nobody else would touch. But sealed behind the post's warped counter, wrapped in oilcloth and forgotten by every living soul but one, lay something that would not only change the shape of his life but would settle a debt owed to an entire community for over a decade. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Eli Tanner. If this kind of story, the quiet ones, the ones about people the world wrote off too soon, is the kind you like to sit with of an evening, we'd be glad to have you stay a while longer with us. Eli Tanner was born in the spring of 1868 in a two-room cabin outside Council Bluffs, Iowa, to a father who mended harness leather for a living and a mother who kept a garden so orderly that neighbor women used to walk half a mile just to admire her rows of beans. He was an only child for the first 9 years of his life, and those 9 years, though poor by any measure that counted money, were rich by every measure that counted anything else. His father, Amos Tanner, was a patient man with enormous hands and a way of teaching that never once involved raising his voice. He taught Eli to read a harness the way another man might read a face, to know by touch alone where the leather was tired and where it still had years of service left in it. Nothing's finished just because it's old and forgotten, Amos liked to say, turning some cracked, sun-bleached strap over in his palms like it was a puzzle rather than trash. Most things folks throw away still got a job left in them. You just got to be patient enough to find it. Eli did not understand, at 7 or 8, that his father was teaching him a way of seeing the whole world and not merely a trade. He understood it only much later, when the lesson was the only inheritance he had left. There was a particular ritual to those evenings in the harness shed that Eli carried in his memory for the rest of his life, long after the shed itself and the man who worked in it were both gone. Amos would light the single lamp that hung above the workbench, and the two of them would sit together in that small circle of yellow light while wind worked at the plank walls outside, and Amos would hand his son some piece of cast-off leather that a lesser craftsman would have thrown onto the burn pile and ask him, quietly, to find what was still good in it before deciding what to do with the rest. Eli learned, turning those scraps over in small hands, that almost nothing was entirely ruined, that even leather cracked from neglect could often be coaxed back to suppleness with patience and the right oil, and that the parts truly beyond saving could nearly always be cut away and repurposed into something smaller but still useful. It was an entire philosophy of the world delivered one evening at a time in a shed that smelled of neatsfoot oil and wood smoke, and it would return to Eli, unbidden, at the exact moment in his life when he most needed to remember it. His mother, Sarah, gave him a different kind of education. She had been raised the daughter of a circuit preacher and could read better than most men in the county, and she taught Eli his letters at the kitchen table by lamplight, using a single battered Bible and a stack of old newspapers that traveling peddlers left behind. She taught him, too, a fierce and unshowy honesty, the kind that did not announce itself, but simply refused, in every transaction, however small, to take a cent more than was owed. When Eli was 8, a peddler mistakenly gave him change for $1 instead of the 50-cent piece he'd actually handed over, and Sarah walked him 2 miles down the road the next morning to find the man's wagon and return the extra coin. "It isn't yours," she told him, "and a thing that isn't yours will sit heavier in your pocket than any weight you can name." Eli carried that sentence with him the rest of his life, though he could not have known, standing barefoot on that dusty road, how many times it would be tested. When Eli was 9, a diphtheria outbreak moved through the county like a grass fire, and it took his mother in 11 days. Amos never fully straightened his shoulders again after that, something in him bent permanently, though he kept working, kept teaching, kept the boy fed and the cabin standing. 2 years later, a wagon accident on a rain-slicked grade broke Amos's hip so badly that he never walked without a cane again, and the harness trade, which depended on strong hands and long days bent over a workbench, slipped away from him piece by piece as customers drifted to younger, quicker men. By the time Eli was 13, father and son were living mostly on what Eli could earn doing odd work for neighbors, mucking stalls, splitting wood, running errands for the dry goods store, while Amos sat by the window mending what small jobs still came his way, his hands slower now but no less careful. It was in those years that Eli's uncle, Reuben Tanner, Amos's younger brother, began to loom larger in their lives. Reuben was a cattle buyer with a talent for arriving exactly when he was needed and vanishing exactly when he wasn't. He was not an unkind man in the way that leaves bruises. His unkindness was quieter and more corrosive, the kind that counts every favor twice and never forgets a debt, real or imagined. When Amos Tanner died in the winter of 1885, 2 months shy of Eli's 17th birthday, worn down at last by a chest cough that the cold never let go of, Reuben appeared at the funeral in a fine coat, spoke solemn words over the grave, and by spring had informed Eli, not unkindly but not warmly either, that the cabin and the small parcel of land it sat on had in fact been mortgaged years before to cover Amos's medical debts, that Reuben himself now held the note, and that he intended to sell the land to a neighboring farmer who'd offered a fair price. Eli was welcome, Reuben said, to come work his cattle operation in exchange for room and board, until you're old enough to make your own way properly. It was not generosity. It was a business arrangement dressed in the language of family, and Eli, 17 and grieving and with nowhere else to turn, took it because there was nothing else to take. For 2 years he worked Reuben's herds from before dawn until well after dark, sleeping in a bunkhouse with hired men twice his age, eating what was left after the hands had their fill, and watching his uncle grow steadily wealthier on the back of labor that was never quite paid what it was worth. The hired men were not unkind to him, mostly, though they treated him with the particular distance men reserve for someone whose place among them is understood to be temporary and slightly beneath their own, and Eli learned early not to expect friendship from a bunkhouse where every man was, in his own way, simply waiting out a season before moving on to better wages elsewhere. He wrote no letters, because there was no one left to write to, and he kept, folded in the bottom of his single canvas bag, the one photograph that existed of his mother, along with his father's folding knife, and these two objects became, over those 2 years, the entire physical record of the family he had once had. He kept his father's lessons alive in the only way he could, mending his own boots rather than buying new ones, noticing the worth in a bent nail or a splintered axe handle that other men tossed aside, and holding, always, to his mother's rule that a man's word and a man's accounting ought to match exactly, down to the last cent. It was this quality, more than any other, that eventually cost him his place at his uncle's table. In the late summer of Eli's 19th year, Reuben sent him to town to settle accounts with a grain merchant, a transaction involving sacks of feed corn and an agreed price of $41. The merchant, in the confusion of a busy afternoon, handed Eli change as though the bill had been for $31 rather than $41, an overpayment, in Eli's favor, of $10 that no one but Eli would ever have known about. He could have pocketed it. Reuben would never have missed $10 skimmed off a transaction he barely tracked closely. But Sarah Tanner's voice was still louder in her son's memory than any voice of convenience, and Eli walked back into that merchant's store and corrected the account himself, refusing the extra money though the merchant, astonished, tried twice to press it on him as a reward for his honesty. When Eli returned to the ranch and, out of some naive hope that honesty might be admired rather than exploited, mentioned the incident to his uncle, Reuben's face did something Eli had never seen it do before, a brief, ugly flicker of calculation, as though he were recalculating, in that instant, every transaction Eli had ever witnessed him make. 2 weeks later, on a pretext about a shortage of winter work, Reuben told Eli that the ranch could no longer support an extra hand through the lean months, and that it was, in any case, high time a young man of 19 made his own way in the world rather than depending on family charity. He handed Eli $11, wages owed, he called it, though it was a fraction of what 2 years of labor were worth, and put him on the road. Eli understood, walking away from that ranch with his bedroll over one shoulder and his father's old folding knife in his pocket, that he had just watched honesty cost him the only roof he had. He did not regret the choice. But he walked a long way that autumn with very little to eat, sleeping in barns when farmers allowed it and under wagons when they didn't, following the rail line west because west was the only direction that felt like it might still hold something for him. He picked up day work where he could find it, clearing brush, digging post holes, once spending 3 days helping repair a flooded irrigation ditch for a rancher who paid him in meals rather than money. By the time he reached the small river town of Marrow Creek, deep in a Montana Territory valley still 5 years shy of statehood, autumn had turned toward winter, his boots had worn through at the sole, and his $11, after weeks on the road, had shrunk to exactly that same $11, because Eli Tanner had not spent a cent on anything he didn't absolutely need. Marrow Creek in the autumn of 1887 was a town that had once believed in itself and had lately stopped. It had grown up around a silver strike in the 1870s that had, for a decade, filled its one street with freight wagons and its saloons with miners flush with pay, but the vein had thinned and then vanished entirely by 1876, and the town that remained was the kind of town that mining towns become when the mining stops, half its buildings empty, its remaining families holding on through ranching and a trickle of freight traffic along the river road, its future uncertain enough that young people left as soon as they were old enough to leave. Eli arrived on a gray afternoon with the wind carrying the first hard bite of the coming winter, and he walked the length of the town's single street twice before he let himself stop in front of the building that would change everything. It stood at the north end of the street, set slightly apart from its neighbors, a long low structure of hand-hewn logs with a false front that had once been painted and now showed only silvered wood beneath curling flakes of white. A sign, weathered nearly past reading, still hung crooked above the door, Mercer's Trading Post. The windows were boarded. The porch had partially collapsed on one side, giving the whole building the look of a man leaning wearily against a fence. It had, Eli would later learn, stood empty and shuttered for 11 years, ever since its owner, a trader named Josiah Mercer, had died suddenly in the winter of 1876 with no family that anyone in Marrow Creek could name, and the property had passed, through a tangle of unresolved debts and legal inattention, into the hands of the county bank in Bitterroot Falls, 40 miles distant, a bank with no interest whatsoever in a crumbling building nobody in a dying silver town wanted to buy. Eli asked about it at the Mercantile, where a weathered woman named Mrs. Odom, who ran the town's only remaining general store, told him the whole sad history of the place with the particular relish of someone glad to have a fresh pair of ears for an old story. The bank, she said, had listed the post for sale 2 years running with no takers, and word was they'd about given up and were fixing to have it condemned and torn down for the lumber. There was, she added, a man from the bank due in town that very week to finalize exactly that. Something in Eli, some echo of his father turning a cracked strap of leather over in his hands, murmuring that nothing was finished just because it looked old and forgotten, made him walk the length of the building twice more before the light failed, running his palm along logs that, despite 11 years of neglect, were sound and true beneath the weathering, a builder's craftsmanship that had not given up even where its owner had. When the bank's man arrived 2 days later, a brisk, uninterested fellow named Corliss who clearly wanted this errand finished so he could return to more important business, Eli made his offer before Corliss had even finished explaining the condemnation timeline. $9, and Eli would clear the property himself, sparing the bank the cost of demolition. Corliss, who had expected to spend the week arranging for a wrecking crew, looked at the ragged young man in front of him, looked at the building that had cost the bank nothing but paperwork for 11 years, and signed the deed on the spot, likely thinking himself clever for having offloaded a worthless liability onto a fool. That was the word that traveled through Marrow Creek by suppertime, fool. A homeless boy had spent his very last dollars on a shell of a building that even the bank didn't want. Mrs. Odom, not unkindly, offered him a meal that night and told him plainly that he'd been swindled, that there was nothing behind those boarded windows but rats and rot, and that he'd have been wiser to keep walking toward Bitterroot Falls where there might at least be honest ranch work to be had. Eli thanked her for the meal and did not argue the point, because he did not yet know whether she was wrong. But he had $2 left in his pocket, a place to sleep out of the wind for the first time in weeks, and his father's stubborn old certainty humming quietly in his chest, that nothing was finished just because it looked old and forgotten, and that the only way to know was to look. He spent his first 3 days inside the trading post simply clearing it, hauling out broken crates, sweeping 11 years of dust and mouse nest and blown leaves from the puncheon floor, prying the boards from the windows to let gray autumn light flood in for the first time in over a decade. The building was larger inside than it had looked from the street, a single long room that had once served as both store and gathering place, with a stone hearth at one end and, running the length of the far wall, a heavy plank counter, scarred with decades of use, behind which the trading post's shelves still stood, mostly bare, holding only the ghost outlines and dust of goods sold off or looted long ago. It was on the third day, while Eli was on his knees prying up a section of floorboard that had buckled and rotted near the counter's base, meaning only to replace it before the whole floor gave way beneath him, that his crowbar struck something that was not floor joist. It was hollow, and it gave a dull, wooden knock quite unlike the sound of packed earth beneath. He worked for the better part of an hour, careful now, prying up the rotted boards one at a time until he had exposed a narrow cavity beneath the counter's foundation, a space perhaps 2 feet square, lined, to his considerable surprise, not with dirt but with flat river stones fitted together with evident care, as though someone had built this hiding place deliberately and expected it to last. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth gone stiff and dark with age but otherwise remarkably preserved by the dry stone chamber, lay a bundle roughly the size of a large family Bible. Eli sat back on his heels in the gray afternoon light, his heart beating harder than the effort of the digging alone accounted for, and unwrapped it with the same careful patience his father had once used on old harness leather. Inside the oilcloth he found, first, a ledger book, its leather cover cracked but its pages intact, filled front to back in a small, precise hand with columns of names and figures stretching across more than a decade of entries. Beneath the ledger lay a canvas pouch, heavier than its size suggested, which when opened revealed not the fortune in raw silver that a man might expect to find hidden in an old mining town trading post, but something stranger and, as Eli would come to understand over the following days, considerably more valuable, a collection of promissory notes, mining claim certificates, and carefully folded letters, along with 11 small, dense ingots of refined silver bearing an assayer's stamp from Bitterroot Falls, dated across the years 1873 through 1876. It was, by any rough accounting Eli could manage that first evening by lamplight, a sum easily worth several $1,000s, an almost unimaginable fortune to a boy who $2 ago had owned nothing but the clothes on his back. But it was the ledger that held him at the table long past midnight, reading by a stub of candle he'd found among his cleared debris, because the ledger was not a record of Josiah Mercer's private wealth at all. It was a record of debts owed, not to Mercer, but by Mercer, to nearly every family that had ever traded at his post. Eli began to understand, entry by entry, that Josiah Mercer had run his trading post during the boom years not merely as a merchant but as something closer to the town's unofficial bank, holding silver on deposit for miners and families who distrusted the distant institutions in Bitterroot Falls, exchanging it for goods and credit against future earnings, and, crucially, that in the final chaotic months before the vein played out and the town's population scattered, dozens of families had left Marrow Creek owed money still sitting in Mercer's keeping, silver and claim certificates they'd never had the chance to collect before hard times scattered them to the wind. The notes and letters bundled with the ledger were Mercer's own careful records of exactly whom he owed and how much, a man, it seemed, who had meant to make things right and had simply run out of time, dying suddenly of a winter fever before he could track down and repay families who had, in most cases, moved on without leaving any forwarding word. It took Eli the better part of a week, cross-referencing names in the ledger against what remained of the town's collective memory, to grasp the full shape of what he'd found. Some of the names meant nothing to anyone still living in Marrow Creek, families long since scattered to Oregon or California or points unknown, debts that might never be traceable to a living soul. But other names, when he read them aloud to Mrs. Odom at her kitchen table one evening, made her go very still and then very quiet, because she recognized them, the Halvorsons, who'd lost their claim money and left for Idaho in defeat, the widow Castellano, whose husband had died in a shaft collapse and who'd been owed back wages Mercer had been holding for her, and, most strikingly, an entry near the ledger's final pages recording a debt of nearly $400 owed to a man named Thomas Odom, Mrs. Odom's own late husband, who had died believing the town owed him nothing and left her, ever since, scraping by on a general store that barely broke even. Eli understood, sitting in that kitchen watching a proud, weathered woman's hands begin to tremble around her teacup, that he had not merely found a fortune. He had found a wrong that an entire town had been quietly carrying, unknowingly, for 11 years, the slow accumulated weight of debts owed and never paid, families who had left Marrow Creek believing themselves cheated by hard luck when in truth the good man's silver had simply been waiting, all that time, in the dark beneath a rotted floor, for someone patient enough to find it. Word of Eli's discovery could not stay contained for long in a town as small as Marrow Creek, and within days the shape of the story, a homeless boy, an abandoned trading post, a hidden fortune, had traveled far enough that it reached, inevitably, the ears of a man named Garrett Voss, who ran the only bank Marrow Creek still possessed, a narrow brick building at the street's south end that had, in recent years, quietly absorbed a considerable share of the town's remaining land and mortgages. Through foreclosures on families the silver bust had ruined. Voss was a careful, soft-spoken man who wore his respectability like a well-fitted coat, sat on the town council, and had, over the past decade, become the closest thing Marrow Creek had to a wealthy man, wealth built, though few connected the dots aloud, on the misfortune of neighbors who'd fallen behind on notes Voss was never inclined to forgive. Voss arrived at the trading post on a cold morning 3 days after the discovery had become common knowledge, immaculately dressed against the weather, and made Eli an offer that on its surface sounded almost generous, $300, cash in hand, for the ledger, the notes, and the silver, no questions asked. To save you the considerable trouble, Voss explained with a thin smile, of a legal thicket you are far too young to navigate. Old debts like these, you understand, are legally murky. Most of these families are long gone. The bank could simply absorb the whole matter quietly, and you'd walk away a wealthy young man rather than a poor one. Eli, who had spent 2 years learning exactly what a man's smile could hide while it counted a debt, understood at once what Voss actually wanted, not to help settle old accounts, but to seize a fortune's worth of silver and claims for a fraction of its worth and quietly bury, in his own vault, the last evidence of exactly how much the town's families had genuinely been owed, likely intending to keep whatever portion he could not be forced to account for. Eli declined the offer, politely but without hesitation, and it was that refusal that turned Voss from a smiling visitor into something considerably colder. Within a week, Voss had begun murmuring, in the careful, deniable way of a man who never said an ugly thing outright, that the trading post's find was legally the bank's property in Bitterroot Falls, not young Tanner's, since the county bank had technically only sold Eli the building and not whatever lay concealed beneath its floor. That a boy with no family and no standing in the territory had no business handling a fortune of that size, that perhaps the matter ought to be settled by the territorial court in Bitterroot Falls, a process that would, Voss knew perfectly well, take months or years and cost more in legal fees than most of the old debts were even worth, effectively starving out anyone who tried to see it through. He filed a formal claim disputing the ownership of the find, hired the only lawyer within 80 miles to represent the bank's interest, and made it clear, in a dozen quiet conversations around town, that any merchant who extended Eli credit or any rancher who hired him for work might find their own notes at Voss's bank suddenly, mysteriously, called due. It was a bleak stretch for Eli, that early winter, watching doors that had begun to open to him quietly close again as neighbors, frightened of Voss's reach, grew cautious about being seen too friendly with the boy at the center of a dispute with the town's only banker. A rancher who had promised him fencing work suddenly discovered he had no fencing work to offer after all. A freight driver who had agreed to carry Eli's letters to Bitterroot Falls without charge began, mysteriously, to find himself always too busy. Eli understood what was happening well enough, having watched his uncle Reuben wield a smaller version of the same quiet leverage back in Iowa, and he understood too that there was very little he could do to answer it directly, since Voss never said an unkind word to his face and left no threat that could be pointed to plainly in a courtroom. What Voss had not counted on, however, was that a boy who had crossed half a territory on $11 and the memory of his mother's honesty was not easily starved into surrender, and that the very patience Voss meant to exploit was the one weapon Eli had spent his whole life learning to use. Mrs. Odom, to her considerable credit, did not close her door, and it was at her kitchen table, night after night through December, that Eli did the slow, patient work his father had taught him without ever calling it a lesson, cross-referencing every name in Mercer's ledger against county records Mrs. Odom helped him request by mail from Bitterroot Falls, writing careful letters to postmasters in towns where scattered families were rumored to have resettled, building, entry by entry, an accounting so precise and so thoroughly documented that no court in the territory could credibly claim the debts were unclear or the find legally ambiguous. He was not fighting Voss with money, because he had none to speak of once the legal costs of simply responding to the claim began to mount. He was fighting with the same tool his mother had given him at 8 years old on a dusty road, an accounting so honest and so exact that it left no room for anyone to argue it away. The turn came in February, when the case was finally set to be heard before a circuit judge passing through Bitterroot Falls, and when Eli, rather than arguing for his own claim to the silver at all, did something that stunned the courtroom into a long, uncertain silence. He stood and stated plainly that he had no interest in keeping Josiah Mercer's silver for himself, that by his understanding and his mother's teaching a thing that was owed to another man was never truly his to keep, and that he was there only to ask the court's help in seeing the debts in Mercer's ledger paid to the families or their heirs to whom they rightfully belonged, wherever they could be found, with any remainder, likely a modest sum once genuine debts were settled, to be used to establish a small community fund for Marrow Creek's continued upkeep, administered not by Garrett Voss's bank but by a trustee board of the town's own choosing. It was, the judge noted aloud, about as clean and honorable a resolution as he had ever seen proposed in a contested property case, and he said so in terms plain enough that Voss's lawyer, sensing which way the wind was now decisively blowing, quietly withdrew the bank's claim rather than argue against a 19-year-old orphan publicly proposing to give away a fortune to strangers. What followed through that spring was, by the standards of a town as quiet as Marrow Creek, something like a small resurrection. Letters went out and, over the following months, answers came trickling back. The widow Castellano, found at last living with a married daughter in Helena, wept, by her daughter's account, for the better part of an afternoon upon receiving payment of a debt she'd stopped believing in years before. The Halvorson family, scraping by on a hardscrabble Idaho farm, used their settled claim to finally clear a mortgage that had hung over them since the silver bust, and Mrs. Odom, presented with the nearly $400 her late husband had been owed, used a portion of it to finally reshingle her store's leaking roof and quietly, without fanfare, gave the rest toward the community fund Eli had proposed, saying only that Thomas would have wanted it that way. Garrett Voss, for his part, found that a town's memory, once jarred loose, does not easily settle back to sleep. Depositors who had quietly tolerated his sharp practices for years began moving their accounts and their trust elsewhere once the full shape of his attempted seizure became common knowledge, and within 2 years his bank standing in Marrow Creek had shrunk to a fraction of what it had been, a slow and entirely unforced consequence of his own choices rather than any act of revenge on Eli's part. As for the trading post itself, Eli did not sell it, though offers came once word of the find had traveled well beyond the valley. He reopened it that same spring, first as a modest general store to supplement Mrs. Odom's, and gradually, as the community fund began repairing the town's washed-out bridge and its neglected schoolhouse, as something closer to what Josiah Mercer had once meant the place to be, not merely a store, but a gathering place, a spot where a stranger passing through with little in his pockets might find, if not charity exactly, then at least a fair and honest accounting of whatever small trade he had to offer. Eli kept Mercer's ledger on a shelf behind that same scarred counter for the rest of his years in Marrow Creek, not as a trophy, but as a reminder, the way his father's careful hands turning old leather had once been a reminder, that nothing is finished just because it looks old and forgotten, and that the truest fortunes are very often not the ones a man keeps, but the ones he finds a way, patiently and honestly, to give back. So when we tell you that a homeless 19-year-old boy walked into a dying river town with $11 in his pocket and bought the wreck of an old trading post that no one else wanted, understand that we are not telling you a story about luck. We are telling you about a boy who had been taught, by a father who mended broken things and a mother who returned an extra 50 cents on a dusty road, that value does not vanish simply because the world has stopped looking for it, that it waits, patient as stone, for someone honest enough to go looking, and generous enough, once he finds it, to remember that it was never entirely his to keep. Eli Tanner did not become the richest man in that valley. He became, by every account that mattered to the people who'd known him, the most trusted, and in a town built on the fickle promise of silver, trust turned out to be the rarer and more lasting fortune after all. Thank you for sitting with us through Eli Tanner's story this evening. If it moved you, we'd be grateful if you'd share it with someone who might need a little reminder that overlooked things, and overlooked people, are so often worth a second, patient look. Before you go, we'd love to hear from you in the comments. What is a time you found real value in something, or someone, that everyone else had already written off? We read every one of them. Until next time, stay close.